Hey there, if you're just here to see the finished gem, here it is. If you want to see how I went from this to this, then stay tuned. When I was a young warthog, my father would make maps for my sister and I to decipher in order to find treasure. He brought over some of those childhood treasures recently, big beat-up quartz crystals. They had character as they were, but I thought I would revitalize them into glittering jewels for when my daughter is old enough to go looking for buried treasure herself. And what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of treasure? Eggs, of course. Fortunately, John Olaf Svein has gathered many egg facet designs together for easy comparison. I decided on a Portuguese cut created by John himself, but he made it for a 32 index gear and only provided a PDF. I jumped over to GemCut Studio and recreated this design with the 32 index gear. Recreating designs is a great way to visualize how the stone will be cut since we're adding facets a tier at a time. Just be sure to attribute the design appropriately. Despite the seeming complexity, Portuguese cuts are straightforward to design. Create a tier of facets, then offset the next tier halfway between the previous one. So in this case, the design calls for facets every 2 indices. 2, 4, 6, and so on for the first tier. The next tier is 1, 3, 5, and the subsequent tier is back to 2, 4, and 6 until you have your desired number of tiers. The art is in spacing them out in a pleasing way like John did here. As I approached the end of my excellent copy, I ran out of room on the crown with my virtual rough. I could go back through and bring in the girdle and make the stone smaller, but then I'd have to fix all the meats on subsequent tiers. Instead, I tried to make the stone bigger by resizing the girdle, but this design doesn't have a continuous girdle, so you can't do that with GCS. Instead, I used tangent ratio, which allows you to resize the crown or pavilion of the stone. I stretched the crown until I thought I had enough room, and then it was a matter of deleting the couple of stretched tiers and starting over on the crown. Much less work in this case. I debated adding a table facet, but decided to keep the design as close to the original as possible. Then, like I said, make sure to credit the author. I use a 96 index gear, and it's a simple drop down to convert between the two since 96 is a multiple of 32. The highlighted number gear means the design will convert cleanly without rounding errors. Once that's done, I could print it out and get to work. The top and bottom of the big quartz crystal was fractured, so I cut off the top and trimmed the bottom to create a flat surface for dopping. The stone was too big to fit in my transfer jig, which meant it was time to break out the calipers and find an approximate center point. You can see the stone is still oblong, which will come into play later. Because I was going to do very bad things to this stone, I decided to go with a superglue-only approach. I usually do hybrid wax and superglue, but in just about every case it's always the wax that breaks. A thin layer under the dop and then a few more drops around the outside for good measure meant I would be in business soon. Oh dear. Oh dear. This is the largest stone I've cut to date, and I first wanted to see how it would go to just throw it on the machine. How it went was slowly. The stone is about the same size as the working distance on my laps, which meant I didn't have much wiggle room. Some areas needed approximately 10 millimeters of material removed, which for a 2-inch long crystal would take a long time. This peg needs to be flat on the platform. There was also another problem where my platform can't raise up high enough to cut the top of a stone at a controlled angle. What I opted to do was cut a few facets at a center point and use an appropriately sized object to trace a circle onto the stone so I knew what I could cut away. I traced an inverted egg into the sides and went back to the trim saw. With a thin blade running not quite as fast as normal to reduce jitteriness and the likelihood of the glue bond breaking, I trimmed up the girdle and top of the stone to preform the stone. Maybe this should have been done beforehand, but by dopping it first, I knew where my center points were. I suspect if I tried to preform it by eye, I'd wind up with a much smaller stone because of overcutting something somewhere. I'm really terrible at estimating these kinds of things. Back in the handpiece it went, and I checked my work by setting the angle to 90 degrees and figuring out I still had this chunk of jutting out too far. Back it went to the trim saw for a final cut, and then I could finally get to work on a 100 grit disc. I roughed in facets starting near the culet, eyeballing where those first ones should align. That way, I didn't have to grind off as much in one go as I worked toward the girdle. Even though I cut in at an angle on the crown side with the trim saw, the girdle facets were still unreasonably large. I wound up calling it quits trying to get them to come in at 90 degrees, and instead left them like this, with room to cut in after I transferred to the crown side. Hopefully that doesn't bite me in the culet later. After I had my 80-degree facets where I wanted them, I went back and brought the remaining meats close with a 360 grit lap. Quartz is relatively soft, meaning despite the size of the facets, I jumped straight from 360 to 3000 grit on copper for my pre-polish. With almost 200 facets per half of the stone, cutting out even one lap in the sequence saves you hours. This pre-polish stage is where I was very careful about getting my facets into place, because the next stage is polishing and they won't move much. It all moved along quickly, and then it was time for the hard part, because up to this point everything had been, as my daughter would say, easy peasy lemonade squeezy. Quartz is a notoriously fickle creature when it comes to polishing, to the point many facetors swear it off almost entirely, especially because for the effort it doesn't command much for price. I've had generally good luck with it, but of course that was on normal-sized gemstones. Some of these facets are the size of a typical faceted gemstone, and the difficulty in getting a good polish follows a square law. Twice as big means 4 times as difficult. Besides my tin lap with 50,000 grit diamond, I also have a phenolic lap, and I tried that, but I've never really had good luck with it, and it left more scratches than the tin. I think it might be contaminated, since it was old when I bought it. After going back and fixing the scratches at 3,000 grit again, I decided it was time to get a new lap. I interviewed Alan Lindbergh for the channel a while back, and he makes resin laps embedded with cerium oxide. Oxides are the typically recommended go-to for polishing quartz and some other silicates. After getting some tips from Alan on their use, I tested it on the largest facet without any break-in period, and the results were immediate. Those huge facets polished in about 20 swipes. What's cool, in my opinion, is that the cerium might polish both mechanically and chemically, and on a couple of facets it etched the crystal. This is apparently easy to remove by reversing the lap direction and using light hand pressure, but I liked the look and so I left it. With the cerium oxide lap, polishing was straightforward. Alan recommends a relatively low speed, using only a spray bottle to moisten the lap. Add some additional cerium oxide powder as needed to help move things along if it's going too slow for your liking, but adding too much all at once can also cause scratches, as I discovered. I could feel the quartz gripping the lap more as the stone polished. If you buy one of these laps from Alan, he'll give you more detailed instructions. Check out my interview with him if you're interested in his innovations. And of course, I had to choose a white, clear crystal to demonstrate here, which makes it tough to show the polish on the facets, but trust me that it's pretty sweet. Finally, after more than a month, I was done with half the egg. Time to transfer. Now that the stone was smaller, it just barely fit in my transfer jig. I melted just enough wax to fill the cone and create an impression of the culet, then used superglue to attach it, with extra around the edge as well as a bit of paper towel to add strength. Usually I put some accelerant on and start faceting almost right away, but because I was going to bring it to the saw first, I let it sit overnight. While that was setting, we could use the crown to width ratios to figure out how much crown I needed based on the width of about 27 millimeters. That converts to about 19-ish millimeters for the crown. After marking the stone, I took it to the saw and cut across the line closer than I intended, but hopefully there's still enough room. I still had the problem of a very big girdle to cut out, so I made some additional angled cuts to try and save some grinding. In all, I trimmed off a little more than 350 carats of quartz. Maybe that doesn't look like much, but in 2024 I faceted maybe 70 stones for a total weight of 175-ish carats. Every carat trimmed saves me time during faceting. So as long as I don't trim off too much, we're good to go. But what are the odds of that? Back at the machine, there was nothing to do but load it up and get cracking. I left the girdle as is to start, and started with the first tier of crown facets at 81 degrees. After a few tiers, I was really worried I'd cut off too much. But we do have to still bring the girdle facets into line here, so after cutting about half the crown facets at 100 grit, I moved to 360 to bring everything closer into shape. Here's the girdle very close to the final position. I'll go over it with the 3000 lap to touch it up, then polish, so I won't be moving it much after that. I left a bit of a gap in here, but the other facets I brought close to meet point since everything will need to be cut down a ½ millimeter or so. And now we can see I ran out of room. What the heck? It turns out I measured my crown height from the wrong facet junction, so I only had 15.5 millimeters instead of the 19-ish millimeters that I needed. I really wish someone would coin a phrase about measuring more than once before cutting. There was only one thing to do now. Squash that egg. Using the tangent ratio feature in GemCut Studio again, I iteratively scaled down the crown and rounded off the angles until the crown to width ratio was 0.57 instead of 0.71. Then we jumped back in and cut with the 360 grit disc. At this stage, I noticed now I had more than enough room for my modified angles, so I modified them again and added a degree to a fair number of tiers to recapture some of that classic egg shape. Since I already mentioned Alan's cerium lap, I might as well feature another of his products. He offered to let me try a dual band lap when I bought the cerium lap. I didn't tell him it was for a video or anything, and I still have to pay for it if I keep it. 1200 grit resin on the outside, cerium oxide resin on the inside. I've never used a dual band lap, but they have their advantages. The main one is you can, in this case, go from pre-polish to polish on one lap, meaning you can just move right on over to polish with a few swipes, without having to go back and find the angle again. For a machine like the Raytech Shaw, where there's a little less repeatability than machines with digital angle gauges, that could be a game-changer time saver. A 1200 grit resin disc leaves a finer finish compared to, say, a 1200 grit electroplated topper. It's tough to see here, but the resin is on the left side, and there's a bar of coarser 360 on the right side of this big facet. I'll be honest and say that in this case it didn't quite work for me, only because the facets were so large and I needed to move them, arguably more than I should have. I'll give it a shot again on a smaller sunstone or something. I switched back to 3K diamond on copper, which I can make more aggressive by adding more compound. Then I started polishing and got about a third of the way through the crown with no problems before needing to sleep, which was a mistake, because the next day I came back and immediately started getting scratches on my stone. The particle gremlins contaminated my lap overnight, or the quartz was self-fouling or something. So close to the finish line. It was at this stage I grew tired of the stone and wanted to cut something else, but I needed to power through. At this stage, I've gone over 1,000 facets on the stone because each of the 368 facets requires at least 4 passes, not including the ones I went back and recut. I went back through the scratched facets to 3K to get the scratches out, then repolished using just a single point on the polishing lap that wasn't causing problems. Once those were done, I switched back to the dual band lap just for polish. Since the facets were smaller at the top, it all went swimmingly. When it works, it works. Removing the DOP was a simple matter of soaking overnight in acetone, then a bit more soaking in fresh acetone to remove stubborn bits of wax and glue, followed by a quick scrub in soap and water. Cleaned up, the quartz egg weighs 153 carats. My first stone of 2025, and I've already almost exceeded my 2024 carat weight total. If I hadn't messed up the height, then this would have been closer to 175 carats. There are 1 or 2 small surface cracks, many missed meets, and a couple of extra facets, but it's done, and none of that matters when you see it sparkle in the sunlight. It also throws heckin' rainbows, but the real test was yet to come. This was one of my childhood treasures, and now it's a treasure for the reason my nails were painted in a few clips in this video, aka my daughter. What do you think?
A pretty rock.
Yeah, that's about what I expected. At least you didn't try to eat it. Yet. I don't know how many hours went into this, but really it was just a learning experience. And you can't put a price on that. Wait, no, yeah, I can. $1,500 and it's yours.